Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. This morning, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about kind of the history of New Thought, of religious science, science of mind, and one of my favorite teachers, Fenwicke Holmes. Now, I think it's important that as we go through the year together, we kind of look at these ideas, the the fundamentals, if you will, the foundation of what we believe, and we look at them from many different ways and explain them in many different ways and draw ideas and inspiration from different teachers as we go along. Ultimately, we come to understand that all are trying to say the same thing. Everyone is trying to say the same thing, each in his or her own unique way. But they're all kind of pointing to the same truth. Ralph Waldo Trine, and I think we'll probably go into Ralph Waldo Trine in a couple of weeks. Ralph Waldo Trine starts his book in tune with the Infinite by saying there's a silver thread that runs through all religions and all philosophies. And let's find that thread. See, let's find that common ground. Instead of arguing with each other about what's different, let's find that common thread. Let's find that common ground. And the more we read, the more we study, the more we listen, we find that silver thread. We find that common ground. And we find that at different times in the year, at different times in our lives, as we go through different experiences, what we start to find is one teacher will say it one way and it will really resonate with us. And then a month later, a different teacher will say it in a different way, and it will really resonate with us. And what this is kind of doing is it's kind of building consciousness. One of the questions that comes up in beginning students when we're teaching treatment is there's only one treatment to give, no matter how many times we have to give it. It sounds like an oxymoron. So we want to come into the process of treatment, and we want to come to a realization in that particular treatment, in that particular moment, that affirmative prayer, that at that very moment we believe as much as it is possible for us to believe. We bring ourselves to a complete realization, a complete acceptance. And then tomorrow we might do it again. Dr. Holmes says, keep treating until you have the demonstration. So tomorrow we might do it again. We say, well, if yesterday I brought myself to this complete realization, if I want to treat again tomorrow, am I saying, well, I didn't have that complete realization? Why do I have to treat more than one time? And the answer is you're only treating one time. But it's an iterative process sometimes, an iterative process of building consciousness. So this is why Emmett Fox says treat the treatment. We do our treatment, and then the next day we treat ourselves to know that we've done the treatment and the treatment is working. We are building consciousness. We are approaching the same subject at a different level, in a deeper way. And this is why in our first year classes, we have students take a request from another student. We have people swap up their request in prayer partners and treat every day for 30 days for that other person. Every day for 30 days. And what we find as we start to do that is that our treatment changes every day for 30 days or every few days for 30 days. Because what happens is our consciousness has changed. We start to do our treatment and it has an effect on our consciousness, right? It is done unto us according to our belief. We say our affirmative prayer, which are called treatment. And our consciousness starts to change, like we're peeling away that onion, the layers of that onion. And then in a few days, we sit down to treat again, and entirely different ideas come to us. Same topic, same subject, same request, but entirely different ideas. What is happening is consciousness is unfolding. Consciousness is unfolding. And our spiritual growth is like that. That's kind of like the microcosm of our spiritual growth. As we go through the year, we hear these ideas, and we hear them in different ways at different times from different sources, and they take on a different meaning to us. Something gets in there. Something that perhaps we heard 1,000 times already suddenly gets through. Suddenly we have the aha moment. Oh my goodness. And we back up and we look and say, I've read this book before. I've heard this talked about before. I've prayed about this before. But now something has happened. Now I'm starting to get it. So that's kind of why I like to go into different teachers. I like to bring in different ideas and different thoughts, and I like to let them kind of stimulate what comes through, and then whatever needs to come through comes through in its own way. Now, in religious science, keep in mind, religious science was the organization. It is now called Centers for Spiritual Living. Religious science was the name of the organization. And the teaching that Dr. Ernest Holmes founded was called Science of Mind. And he didn't invent that word. That was used by teachers before him. Emma Curtis Hopkins was one of his teachers, and she used it. But in the organization of religious science, we are very, very familiar with the name Ernest Holmes. He's the founder of the teaching. He was its head for many, many years. He wrote the Science of Mind textbook that we study from. All of these things. But what we don't necessarily hear a lot about is his brother Fenwicke, his older brother Fenwicke. And that's who we're going to talk a little bit about today, Fenwicke Holmes. Now, Fenwicke was an older brother of Ernest, and they grew up in the backwoods of Maine. I think Ernest was born in 1888, right around there. And it was very, very much a rural area at the time. A lot of lumber, tree farming, things like that was going on. So it wasn't a whole lot going on. Horse and buggy days, backwoods Maine. And what people did for growth and for entertainment in those days was there was a lecture circuit that different motivational speakers would tour. So much like today, if you've ever been to different unity churches or religious science churches, centers for spiritual living, there are speakers who kind of make their living going around from one church to the next church to the next church to the next church. They just kind of tour the country for a year, take a couple months off, and then they go back on tour. And they'll go into the church, and on a Saturday they'll have a workshop, and maybe they have a book that they're selling, a book that they wrote, and sometimes on Sunday they'll do the Sunday service, so the ministry gets a Sunday off. But think of that kind of setup back in the in the late 1800s, where you had this lecture circuit, and these lecturers would go from town to town to town, and they would deliver a lecture, and they would have some back of the room sales. And that was kind of like the thing in town in Bethel, in Lewiston, Maine, I think it was, they were from. And Ernest Holmes and Fenwicke Holmes' mother used to go to these lectures, and she would talk about them with the boys, and she would bring home books, purchase the books, and some of these were of what we would today call New Thought metaphysics. So Ernest and Fenwicke kind of got exposed to these positive ideas very early on in life. And Fenwicke wrote a very endearing biography of Ernest. And he relates a story in there about when they were small boys and their father had hitched up the horse to the buggy and taken them to church on Sunday. And the church had a new preacher. And they were on their way back to the farm from church, and the father stopped the horse under a shade tree. And he said to the boys, boys, I don't want to say anything bad about the new preacher. He says, but I just want you to know, when he told you that you're like a worm in the dust, squirming, and that's how God sees you, he was just wrong. And my only point there is that this environment that they grew up in was a positive environment. It wasn't full of old school fear. And this is how they grew up. So Fenwick was kind of the older brother, and Fenwick went on to become a Congregationalist minister, which I found very interesting because the Congregationalists were the descendants of the Puritans, right? The people who came over here and founded Massachusetts Bay Colony in the early 1600s. And they were very strict, they were very dogmatic in their religious beliefs. And here we have Fenwick, who is kind of like nurturing earnest growth in these ideas of new thought. And Fenwick is a Congregationalist minister. So Fenwick is out in Venice Beach, California in the early 1900s, and he's the pastor of a Congregationalist church out there. Ernest had moved to Boston. One of his siblings lived in Boston, and Ernest moved to Boston like when he was 18 or 19 years old. And he discovered Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he discovered Christian Science, Mary Baker Eddy. And he became very fascinated with studying. When he read Emerson, he said it was like taking a drink of cool water. Finally, he found somebody who thought like he did. And earnest ideas started to grow. He studied with the Christian Science practitioner. He kind of studied what we now call metaphysics. And he started to grow. And Fenwick invited him to come to Venice Beach, California, where Fenwick had his church. And Ernest got a job there as a purchasing officer for the Parks and Recreation Department. And what they did was Ernest and Fenwick were talking to people about these ideas, the ideas that we would now call science of mind, or the ideas that we would call new thought. And people said, well, this is great. Why don't you have a class? Why don't you rent a room and have a class? So they did. They rented a room at the library and started having classes. And this is probably, I guess, 1917, 1918, because Ernest's first book was published in 1919. And they did. Ernest and Fenwick started having classes, and they became known as Emersonian lecturers. Remember the lecture circuit I'm telling you about? They became known as Emersonian lecturers. And they would go around and they would start teaching the principles that Ernest later put down in the Science of Mind textbook. Just to finish up on Fenwick before we go into his work, and I just want you to have that background. I hope you get a sense of warmth from it, a sense of warmth that Fenwick was kind of an older, loving, nurturing brother. Fenwick went on to become a divine science minister, which, by the way, Ernest Holmes was first ordained as a divine science minister before he founded religious science. And Fenwick went on to become the pastor of the first Church of Divine Science in New York City, which years later, Emmett Fox was the pastor of that same church. Fenwick, I guess he retired back to California, and for those of you who know Dr. J. Scott Neal out in Fremont, California, Dr. J used to do a series every year at the Asilomar Conference Center about the history of New Thought. And Dr. J would relate his personal memories of being a student, that he was a personal student of Fenwick Holmes. And Fenwick would always tell him that when he died, he was going to leave a perfectly healthy body behind. And Fenwick did. He lived to age 92. He went out on a Saturday morning and played 9 holes of golf, which was his custom. He went back home and lay down on the couch to take a nap, which was also his custom. And he left us. So he's quite an interesting man in his own right. Now, this little book that I want to share with you is called Being and Becoming, and we're going to cover part of it today. There's just so much in here, so deep. We're just going to cover part of it today. We'll cover part again next week. But I think that this is a book that everybody should have. Every student of New Thought, every student of religious science, science of mind, should have this book in their library. It's hard to find at a reasonable price because it comes in and out of print. The title is called Being and Becoming, the Principle and Practice of the Science of Spirit, which Science of Mind was also called Science of Spirit in those days. Now, this copy that I have here was published by a company called Sun Books, which is out of Santa Fe, New Mexico. And they only put it in print every once in a while. So it comes into print they sell it out, and then a couple years go by and they put it back in print again. So sometimes you can find it, at a reasonable price, and sometimes you can't. I think right now it's on Amazon for $21 or $22, and I think I got this copy for $9, and my first copy I got for $6. But nevertheless, whatever it is, it's worth it. This book was written in 1918, so you have to have the context that this comes at the very, very beginning of Ernest Holmes starting to formulate his ideas that would eventually be written down into the Science of Mind textbook and studied today. I want to start with the introduction. This is the introduction that Fenwicke Holmes wrote in 1918. Truth is not subtle. It is only man's explanation of it that bewilders. The whole teaching of the master metaphysician and the record of his life, and here he's referring to Jesus, are contained in but a few pages. The science of spirit and the facts about the power of thought can be set down in brief order, so that one can get all the essentials in an hour's reading. I have believed this for a long time now, and I have tried to put my faith into form in this book. The casual reader who would like to get at a sitting the major principles of our movement can find a full statement here. At the same time, I think the more thorough student will find some help in the definitions of terms, and those who desire to heal and to help themselves or others will find an outline of the methods on pages 19, 39, and 47. My whole experience has shown me that the first purpose of metaphysics is to develop a conscious feeling of our identity with spirit. By spirit, we mean the absolute of love, life, and wisdom. And we must in some way realize the truth expressed by St. Augustine. And here he gives a Latin quote which is usually translated as, thou hast made us for thyself, for thy delight, and our hearts remain restless until they repose in thee. This was Augustine entering the mystical of his life. O Lord, you've made us for yourself, for your delight. Our hearts remain restless until they repose in thee. Spirit is indeed expressing through us to its own delight, and our hearts are restless until they rest therein. This is no meaningless statement. It is the highest truth of being. It is for this reason that I think it fitting to explain all things as the passing of spirit into expression. We may be sure that if we offer a perfect channel through which it may flow, it will manifest in us as life, love, and wisdom. Then we will arrive at a point where we do not need to demonstrate for anything, because that thing is ours automatically and without struggle. It is, and all is well. To enable us to reach this high consciousness of spirit from Alpha to Omega, to show the simple truth which of itself will make us free, is my desire in putting this little volume into your hands. And that was written by Fenwicke Holmes almost 100 years ago, November 25th, 1918, probably around Thanksgiving. Now this little book that he talks about, the little volume, is a total of 48 pages, and this is a small pamphlet size, a little bit bigger than a pamphlet size book. I guess that's like a 5-inch format. And in it, it lists some of the other books that were written by the Holmes brothers. That's the way they're billed, as the Holmes brothers of the Southern California Metaphysical Institute. So in less than 50 pages of this little book, excuse me while I get another drink of water, Fenwick says that he's attempting to set out very simply the very foundation, the very basic truths for anyone to grasp, and he does, and I think he does as fine a job of it as anybody that I have ever read. Emmett Fox, in one of his writings, he says, "Isn't it interesting how in the Bible you can read a very simple quote, and then preachers will go on for paragraph after paragraph after paragraph trying to explain what the quote said so simply, so succinctly." And he says the reason for it is that when we really know something, when we really have it, when we really understand it, it's simple. But when we're working towards understanding it, we have to go around and around and around and try to explain it in different ways and try to relate it to things that we already know. You know, that's kind of the wheel of learning. We get a new bit of information and we try to relate it to some, how does that fit with the old things that we know? And of course the problem that we're talking about here in our spiritual growth is that some of the new things that we learn will not fit at all with the old things, because the old things are just too far out of line. This is why in biblical terms we're told you can't put new wine into old skins. You sometimes you can't rebuild a house. You have to clear it off to the foundation and start all over again. You know, you've got to scrap everything. So the one thing I ask you to consider as you go through your spiritual growth here on this planet, are you willing to give up everything that you believe may be true? Are you willing to acknowledge that everything that I've ever been taught, everything that I've ever known, may not be so? And I'm willing to let go of any need to hold on to old ways of thinking, old ideas. And I'm willing to let my soul be led into the truth. I'm willing to let my soul find that which is good, find that which is true. We shouldn't take anyone's word for what is good or what is true. But we should find for ourselves, we should determine for ourselves what is good, what is true. In a traditional course of religion, in a traditional course of kind of like the evolution of human consciousness as it pertains to discovering God, we have Orthodox religion, which is basically telling us to believe in somebody else's experience. Osho tells us this. He says religion is believing somebody else's experience. Spirituality is believing your own. We look at, for example, New Testament theology, which is largely based on an experience that St. Paul had, where he was blinded by the light and knocked off the horse on the way to Damascus, a mystical experience. So a lot of what we have, for those of us who grew up in Christianity, a lot of what we have been taught is based on a belief in his experience. And what we wish to do, what we wish to have, is we wish to have our own experience. So for that reason, we're taught many times we have to believe by dogma, by creed, by rote. We have to memorize certain rules, certain regulations, certain fundamental truths of whatever religion we're brought up in. And we have to accept them as being the truth, usually the whole truth and nothing but the truth, and then everybody else is simply wrong. They're simply confused, mistaken, those kind of things. And that's okay. It's a good place to start. It's better than having no place to start. But what we want to ultimately do is move to a point of saying, well, how do I know that that's true? You know, how do I know that those things are so? How do I have my own experience? And this is why in one of the first paragraphs that he wrote here, my whole experience has shown me that the first purpose of metaphysics is to develop a conscious feeling of our identity with spirit. A conscious feeling of our identity with spirit. And then he goes to define spirit. By spirit we mean the absolute of life, of love, of wisdom. And we must in some way realize the truth expressed by St. Augustine. O Lord, thou hast made us for thyself, for thy delight, and our hearts remain restless until they repose in thee. So what he's trying to get us to realize, I believe, is that we want to move beyond somebody else's word for it. We want to move beyond, well, this is the way it is because Jim told me, or this is the way it is because Ernest told me, or this is the way it is because Fenwicke told me. And we want to get to the point of saying, well, how do I know that it is? How do I personally know that it is? How can I have that experience, that conscious experience of the presence of God? Ernest Holmes calls it the conscious awareness of the presence of God. And where Fenwicke starts us in this book is in fact a very mystical place. And by mystical I mean a place of union, a place of unity. Now our society where we live is largely dominated by the creation story that's given to us in the book of Genesis. And it is a very mystical story if we will take time to get back to it. See, a lot of people focus on the Garden of Eden and the fact, that Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden and therefore, we are no longer connected to God and we're sinners and all of these kind of things that people have used to evoke fear. And I want to go back before that. See, that human idea of fear comes into what he's talking about here, where he says it's only man's explanation of it being the truth, that bewilders. Truth is not subtle. It's there. It is. It's only our explanation of it that bewilders. So we want to move back to some kind of beginning, some beginning ideas, some beginning experiences. And what we want to consider where he takes us is this idea of being and becoming. What can we say about God? What can we know about God? And we can say and we can know that we can't know. We can't know with our intellect. We can't grasp intellectually what God is. Joseph Campbell tells us his definition of God is that God is a metaphor. Right? And remember, a metaphor is when you say that something is. Something is. Not that it's like. When we say it's like, that's a simile. Something is. Something is. God is the metaphor for that which transcends every limitation of human consciousness. Let that sink in for a moment. God is that which transcends every limitation of human consciousness. Our human consciousness knows of a beginning, of a middle, and an end. And God is that which was never born, which shall never die, which simply is. The isness, the suchness. The human conscious understands time. Time goes by, the earth goes around the sun, the hands on the clock move. We understand time. And yet God is that which is eternal. Eternal means without a sense of time. It is. It is. It always was. It is. And it always shall be. The human consciousness understands limitations in terms of power. There's some things we're just not strong enough to do. Well, we've built machines to kind of increase our strength and to do things beyond the capability of human strength. We use the power of our minds and our intellects and logic and reason. But even with that, the most powerful machine that we can build is nothing compared to the power, for example, in the sun. Yet that which we call God is omnipotent. Not just some power, but all power. And we even want to take a step back and say, but God is not omnipotent. God is that which expresses itself as omnipotence. What is this? What is this beyond? What is this that goes past, you see? And we understand, as human beings, we understand that there are limits to our capability to know. There are limits to knowledge. There are things we know. There are things we don't know. There are things that we don't know that we can know, we can learn. And then there are things that we don't know, that we don't even know we don't know. And there are things that go beyond our ability to grasp intellectually. The ineffableness. O ineffable one. O ineffable one. But God is omniscience, or God expresses itself as omniscience. God is that which transcends every limitation of human consciousness. And that is the being that Fenwicke is talking about. That is the isness that Fenwicke is talking about. That is the I am. And I am is being. Being. So this thing that we call God is pure beingness. Pure beingness. This is the spirit that he's talking about. This is the love. This is the life. This is the wisdom. This is the power. This is the pure isness of existence. The subtitle of the book is The Principles and the Practice of the Science of Spirit. And what he's asking us to consider is that perfect isness, that perfect I amness is passing into experience, passing into the experience of life as we know it, and it is becoming. It is becoming. That which is becoming as that which it creates. I'm trying to find the exact line here where he said that. So there is this something that is called life. We see it in a blade of grass, but it's not the blade of grass. It is passing, life is passing from the absolute, from being to becoming. Life is expressing itself, taking delight in itself as this blade of grass. We can go out and mow the grass, and we can take the old blades of grass and we can throw them on the fire. Right? Life still is. Life still is. Fenwick gives us example of, I don't know whether he was referring to a teaching story or he was referring to an actual experiment. But the drift of the story that he was using is that these doctors wanted to find out why a dog had been so brave. And when the dog died, they performed an autopsy on the dog, and they looked everywhere. They looked in the brain, they looked in the heart, they looked everywhere they could look in this body that was left behind. But they couldn't find the soul. You see, they couldn't find what made that dog so brave. It's kind of like today, you know, in our lifetime, when Einstein died, he willed his brain to science, and people were studying it to try to find out what was in this little blob of gelatin, perhaps, that made Einstein what he was. But it's not there, you see. It's not in the matter. This thing that we call life cloaks itself in matter. This matter that it cloaks itself in is in fact part of itself, the very spirit of itself, the very energy of itself, taking the form of matter. Take a step back, look at the pictures of the Hubble telescope, look out into deep space and sit in awe at the gas, you know, that's just out there in space. I don't even know what space is, you know. But nevertheless, we can look through our telescopes and we can see the gas clouds coming together. We can see stars being born. We can see the black holes, and we can know that the matter that is in the universe is going back into these black holes, and it is returning to energy. Right? Einstein's E equals mc squared. It's returning to energy. Matter is becoming energy. And then the energy goes forth, and the energy again takes form, and it takes a different form. It takes a different form of matter, a different shape of matter, a different size. What is this thing that is behind that process? What is this thing that is before that process? And that is life itself. That is life itself. And that life principle, that God, whatever we choose to call it, knows perfectly well what to do and how to do it. So what Fenwicke is trying to get us to in starting the feeling, and it's so important that we start with that feeling, because if we don't start properly at the beginning, we have a crazy idea about what we're trying to do in our prayer life, in our spiritual life. What we are trying to do is bring ourselves into a conscious awareness, a conscious experience of our unity with that life. That's what we're trying to do. That's the purpose of our spiritual growth. That is what we're trying to do. If we lose sight of that and think, no, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to do treatment so I can demonstrate a car or a house or a lover, spouse, whatever, we lose sight of what it is that we're here to do. And what Fenwicke told us in that opening paragraph is that when we come into that conscious realization, that conscious experience of our unity with the presence of God, with that very life that moves all of this, that moves through the blade of grass, that moves through us, then we don't need to deliberately try to demonstrate anything, because it all already is. So what I'd like to leave us with today is, if you will take this week, we're going to pick up with Fenwicke Holmes for at least another week, but if you will take this week and just cultivate this awareness, this sense of beingness, this sense of belonging, the awe, the miracle, you know, look in nature, look at the blade of grass, look at the hedges, look at how in the tiniest crack in the concrete, you know, the ants will build their colony, and they'll bring up dirt, and then plants will try to grow in the dirt, and then the concrete will be broken down. I lived in an area that was very marshy, and the sea oats used to come up, you know, through the dirt. And the CO2 is like a hollow tube, like a straw. And I know that when you were kids, you probably saw that science experiment where you take the straw and hold your finger over the end of it and you kind of push it into the potato. And they used to come into areas, around where we lived, and they would try to build something, and they would bring in a bulldozer and they would push down all of the CO2, and then they would put down a layer of asphalt. And in about a year's time, the CO2 had just kind of grown up straight through the asphalt, just like pushing that straw through the potato. There is a life principle that knows exactly what to do, that knows how to do it, and that cannot be stopped. And what we want to bring ourselves to this week is that realization. And the best way to do this, I believe, is gratitude. Stop and take time to sit in awe and to feel the gratitude, to feel grateful that we are part of this, to feel grateful that we can open our eyes and we can open our hearts and we can experience it. And recognize that there is this life itself that created us out of itself, created us out of its perfection, created us for its delight to express as us. And what we want to do is we want to get our bloated nothingness out of the way, because it knows how to do things perfectly. Joel Goldsmith is very clear about this in some of his teachings. He says, we kneel down and we go to God and we say, God, God, I need $100 to pay the rent. And Goldsmith has God responding and says, you're telling me? What do you want me to do about that? I've already given everything there is to give. So what we want to do is recognize that in the areas of our bodies, of health, every second, every minute of every day, there are new cells being born in perfection. In perfection. Because the very life principle of God knows how to do that, and does that willingly, and does that easily, and does that effortlessly. In the areas of our life, of our finances, that which we call prosperity is nothing more than the perfect supply of God, the supply that gives us the sunshine and the rain, just showing up in whatever form is appropriate. In our love life, in our loving relationships, that divine love is bringing us together to be with those people we ought to be together with, so that we can help each other to love and to grow through this lifetime together. And it is a loving relationship built on the recognition of the presence of God within everyone. All of our affairs, our business affairs, our hobbies, or, our vacations, everything that we need to do, they unfold in divine order, because divine order is the truth. It is the very essence of what we are. Ernest Holmes tells us, with all our getting, we must first get God. And this is what I believe he's talking about. Let's start at the beginning, you and I. Let's start at the beginning. Let's start by contemplating, what is this magnificence? What is this absolute? What is this beingness that is? And when we realize that it is absolute perfection, we can understand that it is becoming, it is passing into existence through its creation, which means all creation, which includes us. Divine love already knows what to do in us, as us, and through us. We just need to get our ignorance out of the way, and we're going to talk more about how to do that in coming weeks. But for this week, please just take time to be still and to know there is that in this universe which transcends every limitation of human consciousness. It has created us out of itself for its delight. Our hearts remain restless until they repose in it, and that is why we're always seeking. That is why we're always searching. That is why we're always looking. In the past, we may have looked in wrong places. We may have looked in things. We may have looked in persons. We may have looked in circumstances. This week, we forget all of that. We're willing to admit that everything that we ever knew might have been wrong. And we are willing to let God's love take us directly to it. So we'll rest this week. We'll rest right here at this point of acknowledging that the purpose of our growth is for that awareness, the conscious awareness of our connection with Spirit. And we will practice that this week by practicing gratitude, by practicing awareness. And next week we will pick up with some practical ways to continue to do that in other areas of our lives. So we thank you all for being with us. If you can get a copy of the book, Being and Becoming by Fenwicke Holmes. I don't know if it's available in PDF format anywhere on the web or not, or a Kindle edition where you can download it. But I highly recommend it. It's one of those books that I pull off the bookshelf from time to time and read it and just go, wow, where was that the last time I read it? Something will jump out at me. So we'll see you again next week, and we'll pick up with Fenwicke Holmes, Being and Becoming. So it is. And for the closing treatment this morning, I want to read one that Fenwicke himself wrote in this first chapter in this book. And he titles this, A Healing Realization. God is creative spirit, everywhere present, eternally here. In him is all life, intelligence, goodness, holiness, and truth. He knows no want. He suffers no pain. He is unlimited in time, space, and circumstance. Man, child of God, is divine spirit, shares his resources, lives, moves, and has his being in God as an infinite sea. There is one God and Father of all, who is over all, through all, and in all. As his child, therefore, I am pure spirit, free from ills of body, mind, and soul. In pure spirit I live, move, and have my being. I am perfect, even as my Father in heaven is perfect. The breath which I breathe is the breath of spirit. The food which I eat is the gift of spirit, and it fills me with the strength of the Spirit. The consciousness of the perfect Spirit is mine, and I know it and feel it flowing through my whole body, my whole being, bringing with its strength, power, and perfect peace. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and I feel his presence all around and in me and through me. I am free of all sickness. I am free of all worry. I am free of all fear. Perfect love casts out all fear from me, and I am free. Health, hope, peace, life, good, holiness, love, truth, and plenty now await me. These I claim from God. These in the name of the Christ I now receive. Ye shall ask whatever you will in my name, and it shall be done unto you. I render thanks for the perfect gift. And so it is. And Fenwicke adds to that in his experience, he finds that if people will lay down, I told you he was into naps, if people will lay down after lunch or after dinner, both, and bring themselves into that realization with that treatment, bring themselves into that realization that the invisible life was in that food that they ate, and it is now passing into a different form into their bodies. It is passing into the energy that their bodies will take and turn into whatever cells that need to be created. And it does so perfectly, right? Every cell is perfect. Every morsel of food is perfect because the perfect life is guiding it. Talk to you next week. There's no mastermind this week. There's no Skype group this week. Skype will meet again on the 13th, and mastermind will meet again the following Monday. Okay? Everybody have a good week. Thank you.